In this video, I will show you how to get the best 3D scans possible using Regard 3D. If you're unfamiliar with it, check out my previous video on it. Regard 3D is a completely free open source photogrammetry program that's really easy to use. This is a sort of follow-up to that video, going more in depth into the settings, correcting some of the things I was wrong about, and going over a few things I managed to get working in this video that I hadn't in that one. And in a future video, I plan to go over how to clean your scan, probably using Blender and maybe a little Mesh Lab. Now, since the program is always being improved and I'm always learning little things here and there, be sure to check the description for any updates or corrections. You will also find a table of contents there if you want to skip through to reference a certain part. For this video, I had some specific questions in mind. First, I wanted to see what sort of difference using a turntable versus rotating the camera around the object really made. Was the latter really better? Did it make any difference? Did it help to mask the background or not? Was it still possible to get a good scan without strong lights, like at a kitchen table? What about using flash? And how did this affect textures, and would it be possible to capture the texture if the object was glossy or had areas of low texture? Could this be helped in some way by using small markings, and did powdering the object to reduce the glossiness improve the scan? What about completely smooth objects? I know specialized 3D scanning sprays exist, but were there any cheap, easy to get alternatives? And although I knew having a shallow depth of field was bad, how much did it really affect the final result? So to help answer those questions, I made several test picture sets of 2 different items. I tried to cover as many different combinations as I could, all from either 2 or 4 angles depending on the object, with around 15 to 20 pictures per turn for most of them. Some setups had some angle and lighting limitations though, which I will go over when I talk about them. If you'd like to try them out for yourself, you can find a link to the repository containing the picture sets in the description. The first object I scanned was the sculpt that I made partly with this video in mind. That is, the surface is glossy. I could have used matte acrylic medium, but I used the regular one, which is very glossy and will cause problems with strong reflections. The texture has varying areas of detail. In the case that you want to keep the textures of your objects, it's likely you'll have areas of low texture like this, which can cause holes where nothing is detected. And there are really hard to capture holes, like the ones on the sides of the eye sockets. In most cases, they will get closed, so I will cover how to put them back in the cleanup video. Finally, it's relatively small. When taking pictures without a tripod to allow for a long exposure with a high f-stop, it means that we'll get a shallow depth of field. And the problem only gets worse if you don't have enough lighting. This also increases the chances of motion blur affecting the scan, especially when not using a tripod. The other object was an even smaller dice. It's completely smooth, plastic, and shiny. So if you're interested in scanning anything made from plastic or even glass, I hope this will answer how possible it might be. Now let's get in depth into the actual scan settings. The first step is computing the matches, which analyzes the photos for features it will try to triangulate in step 2. This is the most important step. For nearly anything that is not as smooth as the dice, I found that so long as during this step your computer can handle setting the key point matching ratio to ultra, you can get a good scan. I couldn't get good scans at all with the default settings, but this catches every little imperfection on the surface. There is no need to add any texture or anything, so long as you have an imperfect surface like that of the skull sculpt. Increasing the key point sensitivity also helps, but the effect is very little. It only sometimes helps when doing a global reconstruction. In conjunction with the incremental reconstruction engine, it's usually not necessary. As for the new options available, I would leave these at defaults. TMBR can increase the number of key points, but only sometimes helps increase the number of cameras matched during triangulation. Only thing I can maybe see wanting to change is the camera model if you took your photos with a fisheye lens, or if you're getting really good results with a certain object and you need to scan something similar, you can speed things up with fast AKs, which will decrease the points matched a little bit, but not enough to alter the results noticeably if you're already getting a good scan. After matches are computed, the next step is triangulation, which will produce a sparse point cloud. And there's two options or engines to choose from, the global and the incremental reconstruction engine. As for the other sub-options, I would leave them as they are. I have not found them to make any noticeable difference. Now, regarding the incremental engine, in the last video I just could not get it to work. Not sure why that was, but it's working for me now, and the results are much better than with the global engine. It can usually match all my cameras and produces excellent results. It produced salvageable scans even with the worst picture sets. One thing to note though is that oftentimes it won't work with the first set of matches. You might have to try the second or third pair. If after that it's not working, then there might be something wrong. All in all though, I had more problems this time with the global engine than the incremental. At its best, it captured 88% of the cameras, and that was with the matte powder. It was the only time it produced a clean scan, so it seems to dislike reflections, though I can't be 100% sure. Usually though, it would miss the top row of cameras entirely, leaving a giant hole there. And strangely enough, when I tried to add texture to those areas, regardless of the method, it seemed to get confused. It usually didn't match enough cameras, and when it did, it looked weird like this. I'll get more into that later. After triangulation, the next step is to make the sparse point cloud it created denser. There are now 3 densification methods. I didn't have much time to play with the new one, CMVS. It often failed, and when it didn't, it took a really long time. If I get it working more consistently, I will update the description. But I will be going in depth into the other 2, MVE and CMVS PMVS. First, real quick, with MVE, it's really simple. The scale is equal to the resolution. Lower numbers give more detail and higher numbers less. The default though is usually more than enough. As for the filter width, although the tooltip says higher values produce better results, I have actually found the exact opposite. Higher values produce more noise. Now there are 2 different types of noise. One's bad and one isn't. The best way to show you is by comparing 2 picture sets. So this is the turntable picture set, and this is the camera around picture set. Now it looks like the moving the camera around method has less noise, but this is deceiving because the noise is more attached. It's not as noticeable at this scale. I didn't do a scale 2 filter width 11 because the larger filter width took hours to compute, but here are both at scale 2 filter width 3, and you can clearly see the turntable is better. The noise is less attached, so it disappeared with this lower scale. Now this makes me want to say it's more the reflections that cause the noise cloud on the turntable one, but I can't be sure it's not just the stronger lighting I used for the turntable sets, and that it's capturing some of the background. Anyways, regarding the tooltip, I thought maybe it was talking about the actual surface, but no. Here are the surfaces with the same reconstruction settings, and the lower filter width clearly has more details. Anyways, for the good type of noise, don't worry too much about the noise cloud. As long as you can kind of see the skull and it's fairly even, it's still possible to get a clean surface. Just might take a little bit more fiddling. And it might also be harder to see if there's any problems before doing the surface reconstruction. CMVS PMVS, on the other hand, allows more fine-tuning and can produce nice clean point clouds that look very similar to how the surface reconstruction will look. It can take a long time though. In my previous video, my old laptop was too slow and it took hours to complete and would often crash, so I wasn't able to experiment with it much, preferring MVE because of that. But CMVS is better if only because it has more options. Also, since then, I've found how to limit its resource usage. If it's using all your memory, reduce the maximum number of images per cluster. And if it's using a lot of your CPU, reducing the number of threads should help. Either option, of course, will take more time to compute, but your computer will be more usable. Another option, if your CPU is the bottleneck, is to use a program like BES, which I will cover how at the end. Then, to quickly preview a lower resolution cloud, you'll want to change either the level or the cell size. They technically do slightly different things, but the result is similar, except cell size removes less points, and increasing the level introduces a bit of noise. This doesn't affect the image textures in any way though, if that's what you wanted to preview. Now onto the other settings. Let's start with the threshold. Really, most of these settings have a similar effect. Reduction of noise at the cost of some points, or more points at the cost of some noise. The default usually works well for the threshold, and it's unlikely you'll have to set it to either extreme, but increasing or decreasing it a bit depending on whether you have a noisy scan or not can help quite a lot. Do note though that it seems you can't set the threshold to 0 or 1, it won't work, or at least I got no results when I tried this. Next, minimum image number. If you have a clean scan and some areas have fewer overlapping views where points aren't being captured, turn it down to 2. Otherwise, for a noisy scan, leave it at 3, or if you have enough overlapping photos, you might be able to turn it up to 4 without getting too many holes. As for the wsize, higher numbers can help fill some holes, but usually the default is fine, and I would start with that because higher values can add a lot of computation time. Technically speaking, I think what it's doing, if I understood the documentation correctly, is analyzing more colors per image. And finally, if your image set isn't too big, I also recommend unchecking Use Visibility information, as that usually improves scans a little bit and can help fill some small holes, and the noise stays relatively the same. Note that the comparisons with all the red show any differences between the two, including noise that just moved to a different place, so you have to check that the before and after have different amounts of noise, otherwise all of them look like the noise changed. Before getting into the actual surface reconstruction methods, let's look at the textures first. By default, it uses colored vertices, which means that the texture resolution is based on the mesh resolution, so it will always be less detailed than using textures. If you don't care about the textures, use this, but it's also useful for quickly previewing the results since it's usually a lot faster, uses less resources, and the file sizes are also smaller, a lot smaller actually, than when using textures. The only downside is there's a certain point where you'll want to see what the surface looks like without the colors, and it's not possible with colored vertices. When using textures, on the other hand, you can turn off show textures in the sidebar and enable lighting, and if you want, switch to flat shading to better see the details of the surface. To better preview the textures themselves, flip the options, though the scan might look a bit darker than it look under white ambient light when rendered. Now onto the actual settings. The most important setting for textures is the outlier remover. Without using an outlier remover, you can get a lot of gloss in the texture if the surface is glossy, or if you have moving objects in some pictures like people or cars that you don't want to capture, using one should help because that's what they were designed for. Now in this case they look nearly identical with either one, but with moving outliers it might be different. It's not something I was testing for, unfortunately, when I took the pictures. Also, note the effect is less pronounced on more evenly lit scans, as there's, as expected, fewer outliers to remove. You might as well turn one on though, because it doesn't make much of a difference to the computation time. The rest of the parameters should be left on, but if you're curious as to what they do, the geometric visibility test helps with inset things like the eyes. Without it, you get some weird textures. This is less noticeable using even lighting, but you still get weird artifacts here and there without it. And the global and local seam leveling both help blend rough texture transitions. Without them, even if you have even lighting, you will get spotty looking textures. Local blends the local UV seams, while global looks at the textures more as a whole. Here to the left, everything is on, and to the right, global is off, but local is on, and you can see there's some weird transitions, though they're fuzzy. If I turn everything off, you can actually see the local UV seams. So that's what that's doing. Now onto the actual surface reconstruction. First, let's start with Poisson, which last time I completely misread as Poison. Anyways, for this, depth is what sort of determines the resolution. The higher, the more resolution. I would start with 7 or 8 to quickly preview, then 9 or 10 is usually pretty good for final parameters. There's a point past which it'll just add pointless subdivisions and doesn't really contribute to the detail, or it adds non-existent detail depending on the next setting. The next setting is samples per node, which controls the amount of actual texture you can see in the mesh. Higher values produce smoother meshes, and lower values tend to exaggerate existing textures. This means that it's dependent on the depth. With a high depth, the difference is very obvious, since there's room to change the surface, while on a lower depth mesh, even though you can set the samples really high, as you can see on the right, there's no room to actually add that much detail. Now on noisy scans, lower samples will let through more of what I call noise blobs, though they're also a bit smaller. If they're unattached like these though, don't worry too much about them because it's really easy to get rid of them in cleanup. Now before going over point weight, I'm going to go over trim threshold, which does pretty much what you'd expect it to. It trims. Poisson Reconstruction tries to create a watertight mesh. So with clean scans, this is fine as it can save us a lot of cleanup, though sometimes setting it to 0 still produces holes and low values like 0.1 can help fill them in. But with noisy scans, it produces a lot of excess surface, and the trim threshold must be turned on quite high, otherwise sometimes you can't even see the scan. It can just be a black blob like this, though usually this is only the case if you use MVE for the point cloud, which Poisson isn't really a good match for, but the amount of noise it generates is great for this example. You can see if you zoom in, there's a pretty clean scan in there. The noise was quite even, and because of that, the skull isn't attached much to the blob around it. When it is, as I've mentioned, it can be impossible to separate. But when it's like this, increasing the trim threshold, in this case to its max, can give us a pretty decent result. It will need some fixing, and it's likely to have weird holes and some attached blobs, but the result is pretty decent given the amount of noise. And finally, the point weight, which can be a bit hard to understand. It controls whether the Poisson reconstruction is screened and how much. At 0, it's off, then after that, from what I understand, it tries to make better sense of the noise and how it's distributed to produce better details. Practically speaking, with clean scans, you don't see much of a difference at all. But with noisy scans, when the scan eats some holes in the surface from trimming, turning this up can help fill some of them back in again when there are points around there in the point cloud to begin with. It can also sometimes separate the scan when not trimming, but there might be other parts that get attached that weren't before because it depends on how it interprets the noise. So those were all the Poisson settings. Now on to floating scale surface reconstruction, which is only available if you did the dense point clouds with MVE. Otherwise, the option will be grayed out. It also handles the noise produced by MVE much better than Poisson. So here's one of the cleaner MVE point clouds I had. And this is the default result after the floating scale surface reconstruction. The details are pretty good at level 0. You can bump it up to level 1, but it can take a lot longer. And the only problems are a few tiny holes here and there, particularly next to the real hole by the eye sockets, and the scan is also a bit rough. To smooth everything out, you can use the scale factor multiplier. You don't need to go up too much usually, as you can see a scale factor of 2 made everything smoother, and it also fixed the small holes, and this was the only time the holes beside the eye sockets were captured properly all the way through without any weird artifacts. I tried a scale of 2 on level 1, but there's almost no difference. Now, if you put the scale less than 1, you get more details on the surface, but most of this is noisy and not really accurate, and it can also introduce more artifacts. To demonstrate the other parameters, I'm going to use one of the noisier MVE point clouds, otherwise it's hard to show what they do. Now, this point cloud isn't even really that noisy. You should have no problems with noisier MVE point clouds, so long as, I mentioned before, the noise is kind of even like this. And this is the default result of the floating scale surface reconstruction. You can see there is noise, and I know it's hard to tell, but if you were to look around it, you would see none of it is actually attached to the skull. And this is the same point cloud that with Poisson had a hole in the back because the noise had attached. So here that shouldn't happen. Now your first instinct might be to increase the minimum component size, but just doing that, unless the noise blobs are small, won't do much of anything. Instead, you want to increase the confidence threshold. And you can either increase it further or up the minimum component size, or sometimes both if you have even more noise than this. The only time this doesn't work well is with this type of noise. This was caused by not using a background with the moving camera around the model method. You need a pretty high scale to get the noise to start to smooth out without holes, and that takes away a lot of the detail, and the end result isn't that good. So those are all the settings. Next, I'm going to talk about the different scanning setups. I had initially thought moving the camera around the model would produce the best results, even if it was harder to set up, because this is what you see in professional photogrammetry setups, except of course they have dozens of cameras firing simultaneously. But with one camera, I was quite surprised. It turns out I was mostly wrong, and it seems it's far more important to light the object properly than what method you use. But considering that most people, including me, also don't have enough lights to create the proper lighting setup for this method either, it is actually worse overall than the turntable method. But anyways, as I suspected, it will not capture the background, but there is more noise and lots of attached noise with MVE, which is bad. Though I think part of the problem might have been the background in this case was brownish like the skull. The noise was more detached when the background was blue, as you will see later. Now, when using CMVS PMVS, which can handle the noise a lot better, you only get a few tiny artifacts here and there, but these don't usually cause any problems. I count this as a plus only because the turntable does need a white background, or you do get a lot more noise, though again, it's rarely actually stuck to the skull. But other than that, since I was limited to a single light source because I was doing this at a kitchen table, it caused several problems. They aren't exclusive to this method, but this is easier to fix with a turntable. Anytime you have a single light source, textures will have very noticeable shadow areas. Also, as you can see, you can get holes where the light reflects strongly at the top. Since it always reflects there in most of the photos, there's less information for the program to capture. Now, small holes like these aren't that much of a problem. You get some dips or odd bumps, and the texture might not capture perfectly in that area, but they are usually fixable. If the cameras pointing towards these areas were captured during the triangulation, it's even possible to fill most of the hole when using CMVS PMVS by changing the threshold and the wsize, as I showed before. Much bigger though, or if the cameras pointing here didn't capture, then the textures won't capture and the surface will likely be unusable. This method is also impractical with a tripod, because you need a lot of space all around your object, and even with enough space I would think about it twice because it will probably take twice as long, and it already takes a long time compared to the turntable method. What I did, by the way, because I didn't use a tripod, was I decreased the shutter speed and increased the aperture, the f-stop number that is, as much as possible to let more light in, and then to steady myself because otherwise the slower shutter speed would give me camera shake, I would either brace myself against the table for higher shots, or on the low shots either rest the camera against the table or on a glass or a box, something easy to move about. I got a bit of camera shake in some photos, but only like if you zoom in, and the depth of field was pretty shallow, but this didn't cause any problems with an object of this size. So in conclusion, and maybe it's because I had to go around the table over 100 times, but I found this was a lot more work than the turntable with not that much of an improvement in the results, and adding the proper lights to counteract the texture problems would have just increased the difficulty. For the turntable setup, I put the Sculpt on top of a box to give me space to take pictures from the lower angles, and then whenever you see a set with a white background, it's just this large canvas frame over which I stretched some fine threaded fabric. You want something that doesn't reflect light or have any texture, else you're likely to get a moire effect. Then I diffused my desk lamps a bit with a piece of paper, though I eventually sewed together some nice covers for the lamps, and placed one to each side of my little stage. With each rotation, I would adjust the angle a bit though so that they pointed in at a similar angle to the camera, so there would be no areas with too many shadows. You want the object to be as evenly lit as possible if you want to get good textures. If you only have one light, you could probably get away with one light and one mirror. Also, this isn't necessary, but it makes this at least twice as easy. Instead of using my camera or a remote shutter to control it, since I was right next to my computer, I just hooked up my camera to it and used the Canon EOS utility to control it. That way I didn't have to be craning my neck at odd angles to see my camera screen. I could just preview everything much bigger on my computer and control everything from there. I could do a turn in a minute or two this way, with one hand turning the sculpt and the other triggering the shutter with my mouse. Plus I could set the pictures to save directly to my computer, so that made the process a whole lot faster. So as I mentioned before, this does have the downside that you need a clean background. If you don't and there's objects in the background, you will get a ton of noise. Even using the best possible settings with CMVS, PMVS, as you can see, there's still quite a lot of noise. Thankfully, most of it is separated and it's still possible to get a decent scan, but I highly recommend you at least drape some white cloth or something over the background, or take the pictures at some distance from a white wall so its details get blurred. Anything is better than nothing, or rather in this case, than something. But don't use a colored background. It makes the colors a bit off, which might be fixed by white balancing beforehand, which I forgot. Even then though, you can still get these color bleeds, though this seems to happen the most where there's holes or little data, like in the shadows here, since there are no other photos of the area and proper lighting to average things out, if that makes sense. Also, you can see here what happens if you forget to tilt the lamps with your camera. You won't get as many shadows as a single overhead light source, but they're still dark enough that they'd be hard to fix. It's easier to just go back and retake the rows you missed and redo the scans. As I mentioned in the other method, this method doesn't produce reflection holes, although this is technically because of the lights. Since there's two and they're even and diffused, everything is evenly lit, and the reflections aren't bright and don't overlap between pictures, so it doesn't affect the surface. And again, I count this as a plus because it's so much easier to light the objects evenly with this setup. So in conclusion, I think the turntable method is much easier overall. Now to answer one of the other questions I had, would adding texture to textureless areas help capture them? I thought this might help improve the global triangulation, but unfortunately I got really weird results trying this. For the incremental reconstructions, they worked just like before, but they made the global reconstructions worse. I tried both dots and splashes, but I could not get any sort of decent scan. All marked skulls either produced weird unintelligible point clouds like this, or the areas without ink splashes wouldn't get captured like they would normally. It was really weird because when I did the head sculpt in my previous video, there wasn't a problem. I thought it might be that it wasn't all one even color underneath, but as you'll see with the dice later, that didn't help either. So what about powdering the object to prevent reflections? First, let me briefly discuss the method I used to powder. Initially, I just tried to dip the object in cornstarch. I didn't have any baby powder around, but it should work the same. But no matter what I tried, it didn't stick. I also tried using a spray, but it wasn't fine enough for this and would bead together too easily. So instead, I diluted some cornstarch with water to the consistency of about milk and painted it onto the object. This worked pretty well, except as you'll see, it gets into all the crevices, reducing detail. But if you can find a fine enough mist spray and it was hot enough that it dried on the surface quickly, you could probably avoid this. Also, as you'll see, although I didn't try it with the skull, I think diluted white watercolor would work better than cornstarch or baby powder, especially with a spray because it's finer and more opaque at the same consistency. Now, completely opposite of what I expected, it matched fewer key points than just leaving the sculpt alone, but it didn't deteriorate the quality of the scan. You can see the difference is on the one with nothing, more reflections were caught near the forehead. Strangely enough though, the powdered version got a higher percent of cameras matched with global triangulation than the unpowdered, which missed the entire top view and developed a hole at the top. And there isn't even much of a difference in how that area looks in the pictures. It's not particularly reflective because the light isn't at the top, so I'm not sure why that happened. But with the incremental reconstruction, all cameras were captured and this did not make any significant difference in the final results, except as expected, the scans were less detailed and the textures were partly covered. Now, there are cases where the surface is so smooth and reflective where even the powder won't help. This is why I tried to scan the dice. First, it just wasn't possible to cover it with cornstarch, not even painted on. I was a bit disappointed, but then I remembered watercolors were much denser and stickier and could be washed off, so I got some cheap watercolors and painted those on. Now, since this took less photos to scan and I knew about the texture problems with global reconstructions by this point, I did 4 different sets. The first is just a thin layer of watercolor, and knowing that a bit of glossiness actually helps, I tried to make the layer messy so you could see the brush strokes. It wasn't completely opaque, so this wouldn't work with something like glass, but it's the best option for something plastic. The irregularities and tiny bits of the glossy surface that peek through actually help produce a really good scan with accurate surface details. All the cameras were captured with both the incremental and the global reconstruction engine, and here's what the surface looks like on default settings with CMVS, PMVS, and Poisson. This is the global one, but they both look about the same with similar amounts of noise. Next, I tried a completely opaque covering. This is what you might use to scan glass. To get the paint to actually stick and layer though, you'll need a hair dryer to make it dry. Then very gently, without displacing the bottom layer, add another one. And as I suspected now, the results were worse. The incremental engine had no problems. In fact, I won't mention it again because it had no problems with any of these scans, but it was too matte for the global engine, only matching 21% of the cameras. So I added a little texture everywhere, wanted to see if that confused the global reconstruction engine, and as I suspected, it did not. And it was an improvement over the completely matte cube, matching 50% of the cameras. But this is not enough to get a real scan. So I went overboard and added several layers of texture, but unfortunately it did not help, matching only 36% of the cameras, though it did look more like a cube than the previous set because it matched more cameras in different positions. So it doesn't seem to like objects that are too matte or of course too glossy, and adding textures helps a little bit when the object is matte, but not enough and might cause more harm than good. In conclusion, for non-transparent glossy objects, you can use a thin messy layer of watercolors, and this should work with both the incremental and the global reconstruction engine. For glass, you'll need at least 2 layers, a hair dryer to apply them, and it only really seems to work with the incremental reconstruction engine. Using a fine mist spray might work, as I've mentioned. The only thing to worry about is it might make the surface too even, if that makes sense. Though this might work well with actual laser scanners if you're looking for a cheap 3D matte spray for that. The only thing, be warned, don't try to use much more than 2, maybe 3 layers. When watercolors dry thick, they like to crack. You can see this in the heavily textured dice, and you have to be really careful handling them. This is not so with fewer layers, though still, to avoid re-wetting the watercolors with any moisture on my skin, I used a piece of paper beneath the dice to rotate it and touched it as little as possible. Also, of course, the more layers you paint on, the more details you lose. Anyways, one of my other questions was, how much did depth of field affect the scans? Now, unfortunately, since the skull still had dots when I took these, and as I said, they failed with the global reconstruction engine, there's nothing conclusive there. But with the incremental reconstruction, I do have some comparisons. As you can see here with MVE, then CMVS, PMVS, the shallow depth of field clearly makes any background noise worse, but not enough to affect the final scan that much. It would be logical though that too shallow a depth of field would cause problems, and I wouldn't recommend, for example, not using a tripod for something as small as the dice, because anything smaller than the skull really is going to be hard just getting into focus. And finally, to answer the last question, could this be done using flash? For this picture set, I turned down the brightest overhead light and only left some peripheral lights on to simulate a bad lighting situation. As for the flash, using it straight would have caused too many reflections, so I used a paper towel 5 centimeters or so from the flash to diffuse it a bit. I tried to stay the same distance from the skull, but I inevitably varied sometimes, which made some images dimmer than others. Now, the scan turned out surprisingly good, but the textures not so much. The best results were using clamping that helped reduce all those spots where you see reflections of the flash, but there was this weird area in the cheek that turned bright and yellow. I think part of it has to do with the pictures having varying brightness and the background being so dark, but I'm not sure. Still, I think this would be easier to fix by cloning the texture from other areas than trying to fix the shadows from an overhead light. Also, a combination of this plus a bright overhead light, which as I said I didn't turn on, might work better. Or there are ways to get the background not to go as dark with flash by using a longer exposure, which might help, but that would require a tripod. Anyways, so that's it for all the settings. The last thing I want to cover is how you can tame Regard 3D's CPU usage. You can't do anything about the RAM usage, but if the RAM is not your bottleneck, you'll notice Regard 3D wants to use as much of the CPU as possible, making even powerful computers freeze and lag every few seconds. So to make your computer mostly usable again, you can use this handy little program called BES. It's small, free, and it's portable, so it doesn't require an installation. It looks a bit complicated, but to quickly limit something, just run it, then click Target. Then from here you can sort by the CPU usage. And you'll want to start Regard 3D and start running a step because you can't limit Regard 3D globally. You have to limit each sub-process individually. That is, each step runs a different sub-process, and you'll know which one it is because it'll be using all your CPU. Then you can control how much it's limited with the percentage bar here, although usually the defaults are fine. Then either limit this or limit watch. Usually you want limit watch so it'll remember the process the next time it starts again. So once you do it for each step, it should remember your settings. Then close that, and minimizing the other window should minimize it to the taskbar so that it's out of the way. Anyways, if you have any questions, just leave a comment. Also, be sure to subscribe, and if you want to help support me, I have a Patreon. I'm currently saving up for a 3D printer, which I'm designing completely from scratch. So if that's something you'd be interested in seeing, leave a comment, and any help towards that is greatly appreciated.